Hi everyone. In this short video, I will explain how you can conduct a power analysis. Power analyses are used to estimate the sample size needed to detect an effect or relation of a specified size, assuming that this effect actually exists. In other words, we conduct a power analysis before collecting data to determine how many participants we need to test our hypotheses with sufficient statistical power. So, what is a power analysis and why do we need it? Statistical power is the probability that a statistical test detects an effect when that effect actually exists. A power analysis helps us to estimate how many participants we need to detect an expected effect of a given size with sufficient probability. In other words, it allows us to think about sample size before we collect data. If the sample is too small, we may fail to find an effect even when that effect is present, which can lead us to draw overly pessimistic or incorrect conclusions. Several factors influence statistical power. First, sample size matters. Larger samples generally provide higher power. Second, the expected effect size matters. Larger effects are easier to detect than smaller effects. Third, the significance level, or alpha, plays a role. Using a stricter threshold, such as 0.001 instead of 0.05, reduces power. Finally, methodological quality matters. Measurement error, low reliability, and noisy data make true effects harder to detect and therefore reduce power. Let's illustrate statistical power with an example. Imagine we are testing the effectiveness of a leadership intervention aimed at increasing followers' job satisfaction. We compare an experimental group with a control group. The average job satisfaction score is somewhat higher in the experimental group than in the control group, but we need to test whether this difference is statistically significant. Now imagine two scenarios with the same means and standard deviations, but different sample sizes. In the first scenario, we have 20 participants in each group. The difference between the groups is not statistically significant. The p-value is above the conventional threshold of 0.05. In the second scenario, we have 100 participants in each group. With a larger sample, the same difference between the groups is statistically significant. This illustrates an important point. Larger samples make it easier to detect an existing effect. In other words, sample size strongly affects whether a real difference can be identified statistically. Having illustrated what statistical power is and why it matters, we now need to ask, what information do we need to conduct a power analysis? First, we need to know which statistical test we will use. For example, a correlation, regression, mediation, or moderation analysis. Second, we need to choose a significance level. In most cases, we use the conventional alpha of 0.05. Third, we need to decide on the desired level of statistical power. Common choices are 80% or 95%, depending on how likely we want the study to be to detect the expected effect if it actually exists. Finally, we need an estimate of the expected population effect size. This is often the most difficult part. Optimally, we base this on a meta-analysis examining the same or a very similar relation. If that is not available, we can use an effect size from a relevant recent study. A pilot study could also provide an estimate, although that is often costly to conduct. As a last option, we can use general effect size guidelines, such as the benchmarks proposed by Gignac and Chodorai, to make a reasonable and transparent assumption. So, let's begin with a power analysis for a simple correlation. One way to do this is with G-Power, which you can download using the link on this slide. In G-Power, select Exact as the test family and choose a priori compute required sample size, given alpha power and effect size. Next, choose a two-tailed test. Enter your best estimate of the expected correlation, the alpha level, and the desired power. The effect size under the null hypothesis can remain at 0. Then click Calculate. On the left side of the slide, I have included example results for different expected correlations. The main pattern is clear. The smaller the expected effect, the larger the required sample size. For example, detecting a correlation of 0.50 requires only 46 participants, whereas detecting a correlation of 0.30 requires 138 participants. For a small correlation of 0.1, the required sample size increases to more than 1,000 participants. This illustrates an important point. Statistical power depends strongly on the expected effect size. Smaller effects are harder to detect and therefore require much larger samples. Let's now turn to power analysis for mediation. We can conduct this using the Mediation Power Shiny app linked on this slide, which is based on Schumann and colleagues' 2017 article. Power analysis for mediation is somewhat more complex than for a simple correlation, because the indirect effect depends on the combination of multiple paths in the model. In particular, we need estimates for the relations between the independent variable, the mediator, and the outcome. The goal is to estimate how many participants we need to detect the indirect effect, which is labeled AB in the app. Let's first look at the red box. Here we select a model with one mediator and choose Set Power Vary N. The target power can be 0.80 or 0.95. In this example, I used 0.95. We then specify the range of sample sizes for which the app should calculate power. Here I used a range from 50 to 400 participants, but you may need to adjust this range depending on the expected effect sizes. In the yellow box, we enter the expected correlations between the variables in the mediation model. These estimates can again come from meta-analyses, previous studies, pilot data, or, if no better information is available, general effect size guidelines. In this example, I entered correlations of 0.28, 0.21, and 0.33. Because we are working with correlations, the variables are treated as standardized, so we can set the standard deviations to 1. We can then click Calculate Power. The output in the green box shows the estimated power for each sample size in the range specified. We can then identify the sample size needed to achieve our desired power level. In this example, the required sample size for 95% power is between 186 and 193 participants. We would therefore conclude that we need approximately 190 participants to detect the expected indirect effect, assuming that the specified effect sizes are realistic. Finally, let's look at power analysis for moderation. We can do this using the Interaction Power Shiny app linked on this slide. In the sample size field, we enter the values for which we want to estimate power. In this example, I used 100, 150, 200, 250, and 300 participants. To conduct the power analysis, we need several effect size estimates. First, we need the correlation between the independent variable and the outcome. Second, we need the correlation between the moderator and the outcome. And third, we need the correlation between the independent variable and the moderator. These correlations can usually be estimated from meta-analyses or previous studies. The more difficult part is estimating the relation between the interaction term and the outcome. This value is rarely reported in published articles, even when similar moderation analyses have been conducted. A practical solution is therefore to run the power analysis several times using different plausible values for the relation of the interaction effect with the outcome. For example, a correlation of 0.10, 0.20, and 0.30. In this example here, I used a correlation of 0.20. The Shiny app also allows us to include reliability estimates for the variables. For simplicity, you may initially set reliabilities to 1, but this assumes perfectly reliable measures and may therefore be optimistic. If you have reliability estimates for your scales, you can include them or discuss how lower reliability may reduce power. After entering the required information, we can run the analysis. In this example, I use 80% power. The red output shows that the required sample size is somewhere between 150 and 200 participants. We can then refine the sample size range and run the analysis again. The yellow output suggests that between 170 and 180 participants are needed to achieve 80% power. The last green box then shows that 174 participants are needed to achieve 80% power for the assumed correlations. Because moderation power analysis is simulation-based, the estimates may vary slightly across runs. Do not overinterpret small differences. Instead, use enough simulations where possible and round the required sample size upwards. On this last slide, I have included example texts that show you how you could report the results of your power analysis. More specifically, this paragraph needs to be included in the methods section before describing the participants of a study. I will not go through these 3 texts here one by one. You can read them yourselves. But importantly, you always need to mention the following things. First, the software that you use to conduct the power analysis, including a reference. Second, the population effect size estimates that you used. Third, the significance level. Fourth, the desired power, 80% or 95% usually. And last, the results of the power analysis. In other words, the required sample size to achieve sufficient statistical power. For the mediation and moderation analysis, you then need to report multiple population effect size estimates, and for the moderation, you also have to report results at the 3 different hypothetical levels of the correlation between the interaction term and the dependent variable. I hope this video helps you to properly conduct a power analysis and that I explained everything clearly.